Nearly 2 years ago, the Timberwolves and Warriors made a surprise trade that quickly became one of the most polarizing moves in recent memory. I say surprising because even though there was a lot of buzz around the Timberwolves acquiring D'Angelo Russell at the time, even going back to the prior offseason in which he was a free agent, it seemed like trade talks between the two teams had stalled. We were focused on other things during that 2020 trade deadline, like Andre Drummond getting dumped on the Cavs in exchange for nothing, remember that? Or the Clippers acquiring Marcus Morris from the Knicks, but the most interesting deal was yet to come. In the end, the Warriors convinced the Timberwolves to send them Andrew Wiggins and the massive max contract he came with, along with a protected first-round pick in exchange for D'Angelo Russell. And now, one of those players is an all-star. What's up? My name is Tucker. Thank you for clicking on the video. I really appreciate it. This Wiggins-Russell trade has been one of my favorite trades to look back on and evaluate over the years for a variety of reasons. One, I had a unique relationship with D'Lo as a player. He came to my team, the Nets, in a buy low move during the darkest days of the Nets rebuild, and ended up making the All-Star team in his final season in Brooklyn. But that wasn't all. I made a video during that exact season stating that I wouldn't be willing to pay him more than $15 million a year or so on a contract extension because of what I thought of him as a player. He just wasn't very efficient. I didn't think he was incredibly critical to the success of that team, and a lot of times when he wasn't playing or wasn't on the floor, the team played better. I was heavily criticized for that take at the time, and it was a difficult conclusion to come to in the following offseason because without that great season from D'Lo and that Nets team, they might not have signed Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving in 2019 free agency. Speaking of that, the circumstances around D'Angelo Russell ending up in Golden State in the first place were crazy as well. I remember going to sleep the night that the Nets signed Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant and seeing rumors about where Russell would end up, now that it was clear that he wasn't returning to Brooklyn. Minnesota was desperately trying to move some money around to make him a serious offer, and I thought that was where he would eventually end up. Fast forward to the next morning, and D'Angelo Russell was a part of a max contract sign and trade in exchange for Kevin Durant. This was crazy, adding a young Russell to a core in Golden State that most people believed, when healthy, was still a championship contender even with Durant leaving. With Klay Thompson out with a torn ACL, Russell would play alongside Steph Curry and be a great young asset for years to come. Getting a young first-time All-Star back in a sign and trade for a free agent in Durant that most people were sure was leaving in the first place was pretty unprecedented, and it was seen as a massive win for the Warriors, even for someone like me that thought it was a huge overpay for Russell. However, things did not go well after that in Golden State. Injuries piled up, and they eventually ended up with one of the worst records in the league. But back to the trade that the whole video is centered around. Like I said earlier, the Warriors and Timberwolves were heavily discussing a Russell trade, as it was pretty clear D'Lo wasn't a great fit in the Warriors system, and Minnesota desperately wanted to bring in a buddy that Karl Anthony Towns wanted to play with to convince him not to request a trade. Just when all hope seemed lost, the two teams worked out a deal on trade deadline day, shocking pretty much everyone involved, including myself. And the reactions to the trade at the time were interesting. The value to Minnesota seemed pretty clear. Getting a legit perimeter creator that would also appease their young star was obviously a win. At the time, Russell was viewed as a possible all-star for years to come, and Minnesota had been searching for a true lead guard for years, going back to the infamous 2-point guards before Steph Curry draft in 2009. The Warriors, meanwhile, were hoping to rehabilitate Wiggins and his max contract into a real asset. More on him later. But mostly for them, it was about the draft pick they received in the deal, which was the sweetener that convinced them to take on Wiggins in the first place. Their optimistic mindset was that they could turn Wiggins into something, likely a trade piece down the road, continue to add young assets, and either bridge the gap between the current and next era of Warriors basketball, or use their new assets to bring in a star alongside their championship winning core, one that fit much better than Russell. There were certainly downsides as well, though. It was no doubt a risky deal for Minnesota to make, considering they were a bad team at the time and had been for years, with the exception of one Jimmy Butler year, and the risk of conveying a highly valuable top pick in an upcoming draft was a real possibility. Well, the Warriors might have just traded away a legitimately valuable young all-star in exchange for an awful contract and an average draft pick. In the following offseason, the Timberwolves ended up with the first pick in the 2020 draft, selecting Anthony Edwards and solidifying their young backcourt for years to come. Ironically, a fantastic point guard prospect emerged in that draft that Minnesota might have selected had they not made the Russell trade, but Edwards no doubt has been a great choice so far. The Warriors, meanwhile, got the second pick in the 2020 draft, selecting big man James Wiseman on their way to returning to the playoffs in the following 2020-21 season. Following that year, the Minnesota pick that was originally involved in the Russell trade ended up at 7th and was conveyed to the Warriors, paired with Golden State's own pick at 14. After shopping the two picks for weeks, the Warriors stayed at those spots come draft night, which leads us to how the trade reads today. D'Angelo Russell to Minnesota in exchange for Andrew Wiggins and the 7th pick in the 2021 NBA draft, also known as Jonathan Kuminga. At the time, if you knew 2 years from now that's how the trade was going to read, you probably would have thought that it was a massive win for Minnesota. A young all-star in Russell swapped for Wiggins and a non-top 5 pick. Minnesota won the trade by a mile. After all, the draft pick was really the main part of the conversation around the trade. Now, even with all the focus on the draft pick, Wiggins was still certainly part of the conversation. The Warriors felt he was exactly what they needed, a wing with defensive upside and off-ball scoring ability that could fill a key role at the 3 spot for years to come, provided their system, supporting cast, and development staff could turn around what had been an alarming decline in production and confidence over the prior few years. And now here we are today with Andrew Wiggins as an all-star starter. That's right, the Warriors actually did it. They turned a player that, in some circles, was considered to be the worst contract in the entire league into an all-star starter, and added one of the most high upside prospects in the 2021 draft to a now healthy championship core. All at the cost of a player that didn't fit in their system, is also now overpaid himself, and that they got in exchange for a player that was always going to leave them in free agency in the first place. Now, we have to talk about Wiggins' ascendance to an all-star caliber player this season. It started when he first came to Golden State, where they empowered him to create in the mid-range on occasion, provided he defended well and worked on his three-point shooting. Over his short time with the Warriors, his confidence slowly started to grow to the point where he is at this season a legitimately high-value wing on one of the best teams in the league. Now, if you want to talk about the all-star selection process and why Wiggins should not have been named an all-star starter and the process around that, that's fine. That's just not what this video is about. But what have we learned from that trade in the 2 years since it went through? Well, I think it's safe to say that Minnesota lost the deal, but at the same time, I can't really fault them for making it. Wiggins was never going to become what he has in Golden State by staying with the Timberwolves. He desperately needed the change in scenery and role that the Warriors provided him, and even adding the pick didn't turn out to be as much of a disaster as it could have been. And even though D'Lo still isn't one of my favorite guards in the league, he is a solid, if overpaid player on a playoff team that also, I'm sure, helped keep Karl Anthony Towns around in Minnesota. And even if that is the biggest benefit of the deal for them, keeping Towns happy is well worth the price they paid for D'Lo. But it's just kind of funny to look back on the trade now, how we'd all pretty much given up on Wiggins and then a glimmer of hope came through and it actually worked. Nobody, and I mean nobody, thought Wiggins would ever be an all-star starter. But you can't deny that the Warriors bet on their system being able to bring out the talent underneath absolutely paid off. And that bet was no sure thing at the time. A lot of people laughed at the Warriors' optimism that they could turn around Wiggins' career, and it came off as another example of that front office simply thinking that they were better at this whole team building thing than everyone else in the league, or they were just faking it in the hopes that another team would buy the act and trade for Wiggins. Either way, it's quite simply one of the most incredible career turnarounds of the past decade in the NBA. And with every year that passes since the trade, the potential ripple effects continue to grow. The Timberwolves are now pushing for that playoff spot that they desperately need, with Russell and Edwards playing key roles this season, and with a roster that doesn't really miss whoever they would have taken 7th in this most recent draft from a talent perspective. It certainly never hurts to have more young assets or draft picks to build a team, but Minnesota's future at this point now depends on who they have on the roster, how they develop, and the happiness of Towns, none of which would have likely been helped by keeping the 7th pick in the 2021 draft. And that is without even thinking of all the possible chaos that could have ensued over the past 2 years if the team was unable to acquire Russell after 2 failed attempts to bring him in, once in free agency and then in trade talks with the Warriors. Who knows, had they not made this move, it might have been the last straw for Towns, who could very possibly have ended up on a different team by now, sending the Timberwolves back into a rebuilding phase that they have become all too familiar with. Meanwhile, the Warriors are legit title contenders again, even with a not fully back yet Klay Thompson just now returning to the team. Wiggins, despite being in a million trade rumors over the past year, is one of the most valuable players on the team, while Kuminga has shown flashes of incredible upside in his rookie season. In fact, Wiggins being as critical to the team as he has been, especially with Klay out, is probably a huge reason he's even on the team to this day. Over the past year or so of possible Warriors star trades, Wiggins and his huge salary were always at the center of it. He was really the only player you could use to acquire another max contract since they aren't moving Steph, Clay, or Draymond, but he's now become too important to even consider trading. So whether he's one of the reasons the Warriors make the finals this year, or him becoming untradeable and thus the Warriors not bringing in another star is the reason they don't, either way, this trade has massive repercussions for Golden State. The possibilities for the future of this roster are endless as well, mostly because of the assets they got in exchange for D'Angelo Russell in 2020.